Good morning. I think we'll go ahead and get started here. So this work session is covering the comments that we've received on the draft 2050 Metropolitan Transportation Plan. We had our 60-day public comment period from August 10th to October 9th. And when we posted information for this work session, we had received 1,034 comments from at least 196 individuals. That includes anonymous commenters. And we shared the following comments by topic breakdown in the memo. And so today we want to dive into those comments a little bit more and review the process for adding or removing projects in the MTP at this point, and identify any additional information needed from staff for proposed action at a future meeting. I do just want to start out by saying, while we wrote in the memo that we received 1,034 comments from 196 individuals, we have identified an issue with public input. It is our first time using public input for a public comment period like this. And we have found that some of the emails aren't coming through, so we're doing a very thorough review of the back end of their system to make sure that we've actually received all the comments that we should have. And today we are actually looking at 1,244 comments, not 1,035. So we did receive several commenters that noted that our comments weren't included in the list that went out a week ago, and we have updated that accordingly. And again, we are still working with public input to make sure that we aren't missing any others. And if we receive more, we will be sure to let you know what those are when we receive them. So today, by topic, we heard the most about project support and changing projects. Then we had quite a few comments about content and process, adding scored projects, removing projects, project questions, general positive comments, unscored, adding unscored projects, and then document formatting and some negative comments as well. But really flattered that there were so many positive comments compared to negative comments, which isn't always the case. So again, looking at the action item that you all would like to see at your next meeting, we'll dive right into the adding projects list. So what we heard from folks, the three biggest projects that we heard feedback from to get added in that were scored is NMO 198, which is the Glen Highway pathway from Settlers Drive to Connect River Bridge, as well as NMO 202, that's the Glen Highway pathway connection at Artillery, and those are both part of what you may be familiar with called the Alaska Long Trail project that's been moving forward. And then you can see CPS 047 also got quite a substantial chunk of comments, and that is the Artillery Road interchange reconstruction. From there, the number of comments in support of adding projects drops off pretty significantly. So those were the big ones that received substantial project support to add in. And then if we look at removing projects, the top projects that received comments about removal, the breakdown wasn't quite as significant as for adding. It was more of a gradual number of commenters on this one, but the top project to remove is TIP NHS 1, which is the Seward Highway, O'Malley Road to Diamond Boulevard Reconstruction Phase 2 project. CPS 151 is a proposed Old Glen Highway Complete Streets project from Eagle River Loop Road to North Eagle River Access Road. And so those were the two biggest ones, and then it goes down from there. And then looking at changing projects, the top proposals here were TIP CPS 11, which is the Eagle River Road rehabilitation, and that, as the number implies, that project is in the TIP right now. And the request to change nearly across the board of all of those 31 comments was to add a separated pathway along that whole segment of Eagle River Road. And then you may be familiar with that second project, as it was part of the Remove project list. Again, we heard about CPS 151, the Old Glen Highway from Eagle River Loop Road to North Eagle River Access Road. The majority of the commenters for changing that project didn't want it to explicitly say to remove lanes, and there were also the majority of the requests were to improve the active transportation or non-motorized transportation facilities and add traffic calming. So looking more at those requests rather than explicitly removing a lane for that project. And again, those were by far the top two, and then they dropped down from there in terms of number of comments per project. Under the plan, content, and process, we heard quite a bit about suggestions for changing goals and objectives, changing performance measures, changing implementation strategies, and a variety of other content to add, including definitions that we didn't have in there, and just a variety of additional information. And then project support was high support for CIP 5, which is Canyon Road Project, and NMO 288, which is the J-Bear Perimeter Trail, looking at connecting a pathway sort of just east of the Tudor Muldoon, where that Chugach Foothills Connector Bridge now is, Tudor Muldoon Curve area, behind the residential areas along the J-Bear Perimeter, all the way up to the Glen Highway pathway. And then, what else have we not covered yet? Project questions were pretty equally split, asking a lot about a lot of different projects. Positive comments focused significantly around support for active transportation, as well as support for the goals and objectives. Again, pretty broad spread on comments about adding projects that aren't scored. Again, we had a very robust, similar to the goals and objectives, had a very robust process as a standalone process as part of the MTB. So they had public involvement, they had approval at the technical advisory and policy committee levels before they were incorporated into this full draft document, and the same goes for the project list. So looking at adding all of these separate unscored projects might have been more appropriate during the project nomination period. So there's a wide variety of individual comments about adding projects. The UMed Travel Demand Management Study implementation did receive 3 comments, and then there were comments about commuter rail or light rail studies as well that received more comments than the other individual ones. And then negative was relatively split, sort of generally negative. Some negative about the project list, public involvement, scoring criteria, negative but in support of active transportation or for complete streets. And so that's where we ended up with the projects that came through in terms of the sort of higher level comments, and then topics, and then subtopics from there. So again, what we're here to do today is to discuss these comments and figure out, based on these comments and this breakdown, what can we bring to you at your next committee meetings, at your next regularly scheduled committee meetings as an action item to revise the draft MTP so that we can get a final MTP turned around to you, ideally in January. Thank you.
I guess maybe someone has more background on this, I guess from a DOT perspective, you can see how you're upgrading Seward Highway working through town. Is the Diamond to O'Malley section critical to the sort of the 10-20 year vision? I definitely support maybe moving funds into other projects, but just want to have a full discussion about it.
So I think with the O'Malley to Diamond project, we're kind of taking a bit of a pause right now, taking a look at some of the public input on the project. I still feel like there's needs within that, even though there's some opposition on different things that we've got in discussion right now. There's also some efforts looking at kind of phasing that 105 million into smaller chunks. And so if we were going to move artillery into the program and take out a portion of that, I think that could align with some of the phasing that we're looking at in the O'Malley to Diamond program, which is still largely up in the air right now.
Yeah, you just have a lot of community feedback. Like, I hope this is resonating with DOT at some point. Like, how many resolutions do we have to pass on this? You have a ton of community feedback saying we support this project. And a ton of community feedback saying we don't support this project. And so it's just, I guess it's just getting a little like frustrated. You know, we're keeping it on the stick. I mean, I will be moving as a policy committee member to delete that project from A2P. When we get an opportunity to do so. And it's like the thing that won't die. Despite the fact that population count has gone down, despite the fact that the traffic demand no longer justifies it. So, you know, if our options are limited for deleting or adding projects, when we say that we want to be responsive to public input, we either are or we aren't. So that's my perspective.
I know with that O'Malley to Diamond project, we have looked at traffic patterns in that area. And yeah, during the pandemic, we did see a drop in traffic across the planet, right? What we've seen is those numbers come back up. They're not as high as they used to be, but they're not significant changes in traffic.
How do they compare to the projections from the 2006 analysis?
I can't speak specifically to that.
I think they're lower.
Yeah. Well, I think in general, I think traffic in Anchorage is relatively flat, right? We're not seeing giant growth trends within the whole. I do think that a lot of the input that we've heard is that we need a pedestrian facility at or around 97, something that allows communities on east and west side to move back and forth. So that's something we're looking at as part of this project and could be part of the phasing we're talking about here.
So I'm curious about that because that was the Assembly's initial prerogative. We wanted to see it right size into just a pedestrian passage. And then I believe we were told in a policy committee meeting that we were not able to do that, that we could not amend the project description that way. So I guess I'm interested in learning more about how DOT can change a project description or do phasing. But when the policy committee tries to make that motion, it's not acceptable.
So since this isn't an AMAS project, you know, the correct avenue for changing scope would be through the STIP, through DOT. So changing that through the TIP isn't really the correct vehicle there. I think when we looked at that pedestrian only crossing there at 92nd, part of the concern that we had there is it was an extremely long, either tunnel or bridge. What we're finding is that when you have that kind of length, people don't use it. Ultimately, we want something here that the community is going to use, and it's going to be that connection. So still something we're taking a look at there. But the correct path for changing the scope is.
So let me ask Aaron, can we amend the project description or scope in the MTP or not?
I was writing you an
Only
email.
recourse to delete the. project.
Yeah, I was writing you an email in response to the email you sent me. I've just been working on how to say it tactfully, but screw it. Technically, yes, the policy committee can do whatever it wants as long as it's legal. So, there's some illegal things you can't do, so we'll just put those aside. Technically, the policy committee can adjust the description on any project in the TIP or the MTP. It is within AMAT's purview to do it. However, what FHWA looks at is, was that done as part of the 3C process, continuing, comprehensive, and cooperative? And this description is going to change, and DOT is like, no, you didn't work with us, you didn't sit down with us, you didn't try and adjust it. Then FHWA typically say, you didn't do that in a cooperative process, go back and redo it. Cooperative is through TIP development or MTP development. I always strongly encourage people to do more than the basic. Sit down and discuss. How can you adjust it to right size the project? How can you get that changed from DOT's side? So there's a lot of options available that I think historically have not been, that have recently changed due to. And basically being direct with AMATs, that AMATs has purview over all projects within our area that are federally funded or regionally significant non-federal funded. And by purview, I mean to ensure that the 3C, the transportation planning process, is followed. And real quick, AMATs is held accountable for every project in the TIP. And so I think that shows that the policy committee has the option to do what they want as long as they follow a good cooperative back and forth process.
Just out of curiosity though, let's say we go through all the Cs, 3, 4, however many there are. And at the end of the day, some period of time from now, there is not an agreement between what is in the STIP and what is in the MTP and the TIP. Then what happens?
The MTP and the TIP are the ruling documents. Because if you look at federal regulations, and I know that certain people disagree with this, but if you look at the federal regulations, it says specifically in there, you have to have projects in the MTP prior to adding it to the TIP or the STIP. So if AMATS comes through, follows the process, says we tried to work with everybody on a cooperative path forward, we sat down and discussed and had X number of meetings and discussions, whatever, you follow it, and it still didn't change anything. And the policy committee votes and says, this is what we want in the MTP. Then the STIP and the TIP have to be adjusted to accommodate.
And so then, Aaron, would it be helpful then for me to work with our legislative services team to put together a memo, sort of outlining every time that we've discussed this at a policy committee, this project, or at our transportation committee of the assembly, or the resolutions that we passed on this project? I mean, what demonstrates a cooperative process? So we've had meetings with DOT. I've gone to DOT headquarters, talked with Wolfgang, talked with Shannon in her office. I feel like we've had the conversation now about this project. So what's needed to demonstrate the 3 Cs?
It's hard to say because there's no real outline outside of what we have to do as part of TIP or MTP development or amendment processes. I think that's a good start. What we would throw into it is, for example, we've scored the NHS projects, which we typically haven't done in the past, to see how they align with our goals and objectives. And that's an approach to be like, look, this project as currently written does not align or does align with our goals and objectives. That could be a way to push back, especially if, the STIP doesn't have scoring criteria or anything to show why a project was added to the STIP. And that's part of the cooperative process. Be like, okay, our scores say this. Well, it meets our goals and objectives because of X, Y, and Z. Okay, well, maybe keep it as is, something like that. So I think the documentation you were talking about, as well as our documenting of this process right now, where the comments have come up, the committees are having the discussion, the scores are looked at to determine what to do with the project. And then that's all kind of part of our process moving forward.
Thanks.
Sorry, it's not my meeting.
I'm sorry, jumping. Just to kind of delve into this project a little bit more. Now, you don't, I can't imagine you have this number up top of your head, but this has come to the policy committee a number of times about altering or deleting. And the policy committee itself has held votes on this particular subject on a couple of occasions, I believe. And,
Yes.
and so I guess my question is that not the 3 Cs in action? Having been deliberative about considering the assembly's comments, putting it in front of the policy committee with all of the representation that includes. And the policy committee has made a policy choice.
The only thing I would say to that is your assumption may have changed based on feedback from FHWA. Because I know, I've dealt with it a few times now, it came up about changing the description. And basically the policy committee was told, you can't do that. So they voted to either remove it or keep it in. So now the discussion might be, well, you can change the description, so what do you want to do?
So that brings me to my second question, is that to clarify what you're saying here. Now, I understand the MTP can, the policy committee can put whatever they'd like in the MTP. That's completely at their discretion. My understanding of the TIF was that projects that are outside of like the AMAT's allocation are either accepted or rejected wholesale. They're not subject to editing or scope. And that's changed. Is that what you're saying?
Because FHWA doesn't care who pays for it. They just care whether it's in the TIP or not. And AMAT's putting a project in the TIP says AMAT accepts that project as is. And so that leads back, well, if AMAT's doesn't like the description of it, can AMAT's change it? Technically, yes, but you have to do it in a cooperative way. So it's not like a wholesale, we don't want this project, we're gonna do it this way, move on, don't have any discussion about it. You need to show that you're engaging with the responsible parties
Sure.
to talk with them.
Because in that policy committee could take a Alaska Railroad project, a DOT, a port project, put in whatever change they feel like, and that doesn't put a gun to the railroad's head and say, you will make it this way, but it does effectively stop the project because they can't move forward with their vision.
Mhm.
Okay, just clarifying.
It puts AMATs in kind of this awkward position to be the mediator between all the groups to come to a decision on projects.
That's a really substantial difference in policy from FHWA.
Karen, I would say it's an honorable behavior.
If I can ask a question, what's the change process for this plan? Say that the DOT revisits the scope on this project and it comes in half that 50 million and we want to add something in artillery. If we free up that money, it's a living document, right? It can change.
Yeah, we can do amendments as time goes on, since we're in kind of the development stage of the 2050 right now. Changes can be made now in response to public comment without any additional time or any additional stuff we have to do. But if, say, this gets approved as is right now, I'm not saying it will, but if it does, and a change is wanted, we can do an amendment, which takes 6 to 8 months to get done.
Just anecdotally, I drive that Seward O'Malley intersection or interchange every day for the last 20 years. And so I think parts of this project definitely have merit from a safety perspective. I'm not going to speak to the volume, the congestion or anything like that. I don't know the numbers, but to just delete the whole thing, especially because it's on the list based on a quantitative system. And that just doesn't seem like a attack to me. Good, mostly because I feel like anecdotally the parts of that project have.
And just to clarify, it's if this project is changed in the MTP, that doesn't actually, this is a planning document, not a budgeting document. So it's not technically free up any money. It's just changes the calculations in this planning document, not necessarily in the budgetary document.
It's fiscally constrained.
Yes.
Yeah, so it'll free up money within our fiscal constraints. So if you reduce it by 500 million or 50 million, you free up 50 million to use on another DOT specific project.
Yeah, you know, I think at the end of the day, it's a matter of priorities and values. And whether or not we're gonna be reflective to the community's concerns. And I think every policy committee member's vote representing their entity is a statement of priorities and values. And I do want to be very clear that the Artillery Road interchange is not the highest priority, according to the Assembly. The highest priority is Gamble Ingram. And in our commentary, we said, via our resolution, that the funding of the 105 million should instead be reprogrammed in whole or in part to design and construction of the Seward to Glen Highway Road rehabilitation, Gamble Ingram corridor, upon completion of the Seward to Glen connection health study and reconnecting Fairview projects. A rung down from that, I would say. So yes, we also support our colleagues in Eagle River and all of the constituent what they've been receiving. And I think it's also reflected in this document, the support for the Artillery Road project. What I would not be super comfortable with is just breaking out a piece of the O'Malley Road to Diamond and just prioritizing that to Artillery Road. I think fixing that Fairview corridor that is long languished and that work is ongoing, that has to be the priority in terms of the Assembly's perspective. And I don't think that this project, you know, even if it may have merit, probably many of these projects have merit in some form or another, but it's what are we prioritizing for the community? And are we being responsive to the community or not?
So I'm gonna jump in here, not because this conversation isn't important, but because I think, what's gonna help us as staff is figuring out sort of in the big picture terms, rather than discussing additions or removals, what more information do you need to be able to make that decision at your next committee meeting? Because you can't take action here today as a work session. So is there more, like, Member Wolin brought up about the memo, is there more information that can be brought forward to help decide? Do you need to dig into, you know, what needs to be changed? Do you need more information about the recommended changes? Do you need more analysis to be done? I hesitate to say this, but do you need a model run to happen with changes in order to see what that does to the system? You know, there are a lot of things that we could potentially do. We don't have a lot of time if you want to see this at your November meeting. So maybe just having more time to digest it is all you need, and that's totally fine too. But if you want to see this in November, we do need to get the technical advisory committee materials out this Thursday. So we really don't have a lot of time. We can do it in December. It's not a rush on our end, particularly. It would be nice to get it done sooner than later, but yeah, just a few thoughts there.
I do have a question. The Seward to Glen Pell and continuing to move forward with it and making really positive changes in that area. It's a huge priority for DOT as well. How, and I don't want to lose any momentum as we're going through the Pell process and rolling right into the design of an alternative, kind of trying to make changes as soon as possible in that area. What would be needed, I guess, to get a new project started here? Is there anything on staff's end that would be appropriate to draft?
So right now, we do have complete streets for Gamble and Ingra in the MTP. They did score high enough. They're in the fiscal constraint. I know that's not necessarily what's going to come out of, either of those processes, but I think they could stand as the placeholder in addition to mentioning the health process and reconnected communities in the MTP of itself, knowing that, the time between planning and construction can be long. But we'll also be doing a new MTP in the next 4 years, so, incorporated that, could be incorporated as the amendment that Aaron spoke to. I think there are lots of different options for that.
There are a handful, and I think that's a good point. Daniel, do you feel like the projects focusing on Fairview are being captured in the MTP?
I would like it to be a little bit more explicit that it's a placeholder for construction, design and construction upon completion of those studies. And that there's a realistic dollar amount associated with what that's gonna take. And, the reality is that some of the alternates that will be presented will likely be expensive. So I don't know how much off the top of my head, Complete Streets, is funded for. While you're looking that up, Chelsea, one question I have is about the scoring, because I think when I was looking through the MTP, the TIP projects, I didn't see the scoring right alongside them. Projects, their score was up before.
Most of the TIP projects were scored using the TIP criteria when we added them into the TIP. There are a couple of grandfathered projects, but they're basically done, like O'Malley, it's constructed, so it's done. But we had a scoring system that was used for the TIP. The NHS projects have not been shown scoring or criteria that was used for those projects to be included into this TIP. And we didn't score them here's the problem. In the past, only projects that AMAT's funded were scored. Everything else was just wholesale added in. That's caused some concerns because it's like, are these projects being added to TIP meeting AMAT's goals, objectives, performance measures? And so it's caused some discussion that needs to happen for future TIPs as we go forward about whether we score and rank all projects that are added to the TIP or not. So almost all the projects that are in the MTP are scored, except for, and I have to make a correction here because I misspoke, the NHS projects and the CIP projects, the munis ones that are specific to their program. Because they have a scoring process that they go through, we know about it, so we just assume that they were meeting their goals and objectives and support that.
Okay, so for instance, the O'Malley Diamond project, has that been scored?
Yes.
So AMAT's through the updated scoring that involves equity, et cetera.
Yes, I believe we have Chelsea, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we have the final scores. We just completed that actually.
And do you mind just going over what the criteria is for these? The
Yes.
scoring.
There are 20 different criteria from under each of the goals. So it's pretty expensive. Read in detail this project prioritization dependency appendix 5. Yeah, it's a lot.
So 32 point something for the O'Malley to Diamond. Is that a high score relative to, where was that?
The highest the project could score, I believe, was 100. I don't think we had any project score 100. I think it's like 80, 79 or something was the highest.
And I think we heard that the Artillery Road interchange did not score high enough to be prioritized. What was
Correct.
its score? How does that compare to the?
Great question. So artillery scored 27.5.
So lower, okay.
And this is not the final list because we made some, this is the list that you all saw in your work session on the fiscal constraint, but just for reference, at that point in time, we did make some changes to the fiscal constraint just to clean it up. There were some errors in the Excel one, but the low 40s was about where we started cutting Complete Streets project off.
in the low forties. Okay. The one that you had just pulled up before, that it was $22 million for the complete streets, Gamble and Ingress.
So that's, yeah. Now,
Gamble Street, okay, so that's at a score of 63.
Yeah.
Okay,
8.
so I think that's notable on the 68. So. Interesting, I think, I think that just kind of demonstrates, I mean, I guess I'm just, it's interesting to think about the scoring because there's like the NHS projects that can score 30 something and still be on the plan. And then there's the Complete Streets project that can score maybe much higher, but not be prioritized. And maybe that has to do with timelines of projects and how long they've been programmed. Is there, I mean, can you guys kind of like unpack that for me a little bit? Like why? How are those NHS projects still on here if they're scoring in the 30s?
Because previously the NHS projects have just been pulled through.
And okay, so that's kind of what Aaron said earlier. So, okay,
So we are changing things
interesting.
based on feedback from our HWI.
Okay.
Continuous learning process.
Yeah, well, thank you for explaining that. And I hope that policy committee members will take that into account when they're prioritizing projects and MTP.
So we have these Inger Gamble projects. Are they on our list of projects to include in the 2050 MTP? Okay, so Inger Gamble Complete Streets are on there. That may not cover everything for the Sewer to Glen connection, just because we don't know what's gonna come out of there. So it's really hard for us to just randomly guess. You know, we can't just randomly guess. We have to have backup to why we're including something in both cost and description. So that's why we didn't really put a project in here from that PEL because it hasn't been done yet.
And then I will just flag that 5th and 6th, Ida Reed is in here as a Complete Streets project. So again, I don't know that any of those 3 cover all of what will come out of those projects, but perhaps between the 3, they cover more than that.
As we first said that we had those maps for the MTP open houses that had all the geographic areas broken out. And that might be helpful for James to see all the various projects. There's at least 4 or 5 non-motorized complete streets categories, at least 5 that I am aware of, just in the table, but.
Yeah, I just think it's interesting because even the ones that you were showing, I think they have like specific language about a reduction of a lane. But we don't know what those alternatives are. So I wonder if it would be more appropriate to combine those projects into one placeholder for like a holistic reconstruction of the corridor, or if it's better to have them broken out like they are now.
The problem is, you know, in the past when we don't really do placeholders because we can't really do placeholders. We have to have specific projects identified. That's like, this is an independent project. And in the past, we've had documents to go on to be like, okay, this study or PEL was done. And since it hasn't been completed, our historical process is don't add anything in until the study is done. So in the 2040, you'll notice that there are projects in there to connect sewer to Glen. That's because there was no study underway. And so we just made the best guess at that point. But because there's a study underway, there's kind of this weird period that we're in right now. Because if we add it in and it's not match up with the study, then it becomes a problem there and we have to do an amendment to adjust it. So, you know.
And maybe on that note, I would also just bring us into this discussion around changing projects based on either the feedback we received or otherwise. We did get a lot of feedback to change, as you saw, like nearly every project. And a lot of those are consistent with the project descriptions as they are. A lot of those were like considered noise, which isn't something that we have in the past necessarily put in project descriptions, but perhaps is worthwhile. And I would say is consistent with the goals and objectives of the MTP. So I think that would be one area that would be helpful for committees to provide us some feedback on. Is that something, as an example, is that something that you all think would be reasonable for us to add to a project description? And then, it goes from that all the way to, don't remove the lanes, for that complete streets project, on the Old Glen and Eagle River. And then, also rewriting project descriptions. So there's a lot of detail in that section. And I can bring it back to looking at, again, those projects that were flagged the most for changing the descriptions. Again, really focused on at Eagle River Road rehabilitation, adding the pathway. To that more explicitly to that project description. The project description currently says consider non-motorized. And then, like I said, that holds Glen Highway. Let's see the scores off the top of my head, look at it. But again, I don't think it's worth the committee's time to look at 153 different description changes, but I think it would be helpful for staff if committees had a position on what is appropriate for changing your project description. The descriptions came in as nominations, so we have refrained from changing them as best as possible, other than clarifying what we believe the intent was. But going forward, should we address these 153 plus project descriptions changes?
I want to ask one more question about the scoring, and I want other people to ask questions. I feel like I'm monopolizing this, so I apologize, but when we're creating the draft MTP, there's projects that were not programmed because they didn't score high enough. Correct. But on the NHS projects that we decided to score because we're not aware of the previous scoring, that same approach was not taken. They still exist in the MTP. So it's not like if they didn't score, were projects programmed or deprogrammed based on their score for those NHS projects? And if not, why?
We just scored them, recognizing that this was, new information has come in from FHWA since we went through the scoring process. So we have just scored them to include those scores as part of the general understanding.
Will AMAT staff then take the ones that don't score high enough off?
It's up to the committees at this point on what to do with those NHS projects. The reality is we took those projects from the tip because they were already programmed in the tip and just carried them forward for the 2050 MTP. Because that's how it's been done at the beginning of time. And so there is an opportunity for the committees to step in and say, we're going to do it differently this go round, and these projects didn't score well, so take them out and put some other stuff on. But you got to remember, those are still DOT funds. And so if you take them out, what of DOT is going to fill in its place? And again, it's that cooperative process. And Kevin Cross, I think Melinda, you had your hand raised first and then Kevin.
Okay, so some of my perspective on individual changes to the titles of the project. I guess personally, I'm more interested in generic descriptions to let the whole context sensitive process play out. The goal may be active transportation, but not providing bias of it has to be a separated pathway. Because the project team has to look at all the needs, they have to look at all the constraints, right away, other businesses or property owners, including noise. All those things should be looked at from a project perspective. And the more flexible that we can do that is, I think it helps versus providing that included in the title, because then it all of a sudden it sort of starts driving a project and leaning into it in one direction versus doing what we normally do, which is to be unbiased and look at all the the other plans that help inform the process, you know, if it's a non-motorized plan, doing the public involvement process. So that's just some of my perspective I wanted to share, instead of going back and upping.
Yeah, and I would say for that, we have left the pretty detailed descriptions that we received as part of the project nomination period process in there. And that's how those projects were scored. So I think if it were more higher level, certain parts, again, there were 20 different scoring criteria. Some of it is like basically going down to like the wayfinding level. And so if the project description hadn't included some of the language, when it was nominated, it may not have scored such. So I think some of the changes to project description could change the project scores.
Yeah, it's become a real issue for us to keep them generic. Because what we've discovered is that the process of going from MTP to TIP to design construction, stuff is lost from the public. They say, we would like to see this, an actual separated pathway. Well, it just becomes generic and then becomes a sidewalk, an attached sidewalk. And that didn't meet the intent that the public was looking for. And then somebody is like, well, why didn't you do this? Well, it wasn't in the project description. So, you know, it's nice to want a generic description, but when everybody then turns around and say, you planning didn't put it in the project description, so we didn't do it. Well, that's a problem for us. So our recommendation is to keep them a little more specific than they have been in the past and put information in there somehow. We're still trying to figure out how to do this, trying to keep some of the information that the public is asking for us to include in the project description. To be like, project will consider X, Y, and Z as part of the process, something like that. So you're not forced into it, but at least putting a note in there for the project manager. Oh, okay, the public wants to look at a separated pathway here instead of a sidewalk. Cool. What would that look like? Oh, we can't do it because we're going to take 25 homes. Okay, well, we won't do that for this project. We'll do an attached sidewalk because that's easier. But at least we looked at it and responded to the public's feedback to us. So we're trying to find that happy middle ground.
Good.
So that it may take some, because as you know, somebody put in Fireweed needs to be X number of lanes and that caused a problem. So that was too specific. So that's not the level we're getting at.
Good.
But we don't want this information lost that's really rich coming from the public. Okay, Kevin Cross.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Excellent. You know, I'm curious on how, again, on the scoring system, how some of these things balance out. You know, again, just speaking to the Artillery Road, and I know you were speaking about that earlier, and I apologize, I was listening in, but I was at the same time in another meeting, so I was balancing being two places at once. But Artillery Road is basically two separate projects. It's a motorized and non-motorized, yet, you know, if you look at that project, you look at Eagle Academy and you look at the surrounding, that's really just one project that incorporates both of them. So individually, you end up with two projects that maybe don't score as high, but if they were combined into what realistically will be one effort, it scores higher. Can you tell me how we make adjustments and how those things are taken into consideration when you have a non-motorized project simultaneous to a motorized project, but they're essentially the same project, but two separate scores? Can you tell me how that gets balanced out and how we work around that to make sure that projects such as Artillery Road just don't get waylaid or just, you know, that because of our scoring mechanism, maybe you're not given the gravity that they need? Thank you.
Jump in, but not providing accurate information, but Artillery Interchange was scored as a complete streets project, so it was scored as considering all modes. And we also received, so it was in some regard considering a pathway, even though maybe not explicitly considering a pathway, unless that's in the project description, which we can look at. But then we got 600 project nominations, and through our process of scoring and so forth and fiscal analysis, we did our best to combine projects where they made sense, but again, in keeping with sort of the intent of the public nomination, we didn't overly combine projects. And that's not to say that we did a perfect job of combining projects that maybe should have been combined. Again, when you're looking at 600 projects, quarter of which may be overlapping or more, it is hard to know when to draw the balance there as staff to make that call while keeping with the intent of the public, but also combining things where they may be appropriate. So I think that is perhaps my response to that, where they ended up with as two projects because they were nominated as two projects. And
I believe the artillery road does consider non-motorized improvements in there. And our complete streets criteria does have a section for improvements for active transportation users as part of that complete street. Let's see, yeah, I guess it didn't. Yeah, so we'd have to look at that one and see if that would score differently if we added in the active transportation user component of it. It'd probably get a little bit of a higher score. But not much, I'll be honest, not much.
Well, it's still, and I appreciate it. I mean, again, I'm just coming from curiosity here, not judgment, which is just if you have a non-motorized and motorized or an active transportation study and yet, looking at it when if you're standing on the sidewalk looking at the project, you just realize they're all part of the same project. Now, I understand for the purposes of studies and collecting data, sometimes that we divide these up so we can see the individual impacts. But from practical applications, at what point do we merge those? And and I really appreciate it. Again, I know that this is a lot of work you guys have put on. There's a huge need out there, and so you're trying to fit 10 pounds of stuff in a 5-gallon bucket. I understand. Just curious on how we consolidate some of those to make sure that we've got accurate scoring. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
And that's definitely a request that could come from the committee as part of this work session, is to rescore that project, making sure that we are including non-motorized. That would be our active transportation. That would be a very clear direction based on the intent of this work plan. That would help.
Yeah, we can do that.
No, I'd be in favor of that, because I would expect that we would start looking at every need, active transportation, the circulation, and how it all fits into that community.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I thought it was already in the description, so. It's kind of innate where I think just every project includes it, and I keep forgetting that there's some that don't. Okay, Brad.
Hi, yeah, so sorry, I'm in a car, so hopefully it won't be too loud. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay, so with regards to Artillery Road and having done different scoring for projects, I recognize that scoring has its limitations, which is why it's not the decision making, but instead a resource. So I would say with Artillery Road as one with the bridge strikes that we've had, there are very unique situations that I think need to be taken into consideration, and I would be supportive of the discussions and the changes to be able to include it and take something else out, given how critical that is for everybody in Eagle River and to the north. So that's my comment on that one. I don't have too much time, so I do have a few other questions I wouldn't mind getting an answer to, whether now's a good time to ask them. Is it all right if I? Okay, one of the things that is kind of on my mind is the downtown's engineering streets engineering study. And one of the things that I know I've heard a lot of from a lot of different places is considering two-way in 5th and 6th Avenue. And the concept that I've been wondering, and I think that study could look at and probably should look at, is two-waying those streets to the west of C and A couplet. But and kind of with the implications that would have for all the traffic using those streets and I and L to connect to Minnesota. And I'm wondering, I don't know if the MTP, which looks at everything regionally, has capacity to run a scenario that could look at those sorts of things, or is that something that the downtown streets engineering study really should take the lead on, and whatever comes out of that, we can look at kind of these system-wide implications that that major change would have to the downtown, South Addition, Midtown area.
Is on the list. Not this one, the actual. Yeah, that one. Yeah, Fifth and Sixth Avenue, complete streets, Spider Reed.
Brad, we didn't look at that as part of the model up until this point.
We did. It's on this list here, so it would have been included in our model run. Wouldn't it have been?
A two-way in Fifth and Sixth concept.
Okay,
No, that's not.
okay, so it's just keeping it as one way, just removing a lane, slowing, upgrade. Okay,
Maybe including that as an option in the description.
Yeah, this is Ida Reeves, so we would have to break it out into separate projects. If that were the case. I think, Brad, I think it would still be valuable for the downtown streets engineering study to look at that, separate from this process.
Okay, if there's anything that this process can do to aid that, then I'd be interested to hear what that might be. But I recognize, yeah, how projects intermix with the MTP and interact with it. It is a challenging question, and which kind of comes down to the Sewer to Glen PEL as well, because as something that Roland was mentioning, that is, in my mind, one of the most important projects that Anchorage has that can really change a lot. Kind of in the same way I'm thinking this Fifth and Sixth concept could be. So these are major things that I feel like if some of the funding that is currently put into O'Malley to Diamond, I mean, I see these other things as a priority. And so when I remember the discussion we had about O'Malley to Diamond and that concept, looking at it in isolation versus looking at it as priorities and where should our money go, that's a different discussion. I don't think we had the discussion of which of these is a greater priority and be of more benefit to the city. And in that context, I could see taking out O'Malley to Diamond, which is different than what the finding was that we had when we talked about it before. So I just wanted to voice that perspective with regards to that item.
Yeah, and I guess going back to your two-way requests for those roads and looking at the model, we do anticipate having changes from the committees to the project list, which would likely affect the model. Again, as you may remember, the model didn't show significantly different changes over all of the different scenarios between now and 2050. So it's hard to say whether any changes would have much of an effect, but we do have budget, I guess I will say, to run the model again. If there is more than just that request, or if that request is to run the model to show what that would do.
If there is budget available, I would love it to be put onto this item, because this is a top priority, imminent sort of thing that the further we can get down the road now on it, hopefully the quicker it could be implemented if it is an outcome that I think there's a lot of interest in. And of all the things that have the different projects, this could be one, you know, when you two-way a street and you take that traffic out of there and they get diverted to A and C. I mean, these are some major regional changes, more than I think most of any of the other projects that are in the MTP that I was seeing. So I would really be supportive of looking into that if it fits into this, yeah, with recognition that there's things that I might not know as far as the schedule and the timing and the extent, because that is a fairly major, well, a very major change to the model to look at that scenario, in my mind, as far as like all the other follow-on implications that it could have for ANC and for INL and for Minnesota, and how do you get over to Minnesota? Does it affect International? Does it affect Tudor? Does it affect 15th? Northern Lights and Benson? Like, you know, there's so many like secondary questions that it could raise that I don't want to create a rabbit hole, but I also want some resources to be able to move that along quickly.
What's the deadline for approval of the plan?
Our deadline for AMETS is August 2024. But I will caveat that we are not doing an amendment on the 2040 MTP to add projects that are proposed in the upcoming STIP. So we are, because they are included in the draft 2050, so we are hoping to get it approved in January, if at all possible, so that it can line up with the STIP timeline. But our deadline is August.
Sorry, Brad, did you have more?
Those were the major ones. I think a lot of the other thoughts that I'd had are getting to be addressed, but yeah, I might chime in a little bit later if I have other ideas. But thanks for letting me have some time. Thanks.
Follow on. Go ahead.
So just for clarification, the MTP modeling that you're going to do though is macro modeling. And it's either all in or the existing system. It's not, what happens if this project goes in or out, right? I mean, that's another 500 different scenarios right? So it's the model that you're going to see at the end of this is everything in versus existing.
Right, so if we did another model run, or when we do another model run, we would be looking at, the 5 major changes that we hear from the committee or something like that, rather than 5 different model runs for each of those changes.
Yeah, so you're not going to be able to see like, okay, well, complete streets, 5th and 6th, what happens? And then, you're not going to have a different model run with trying to get into a 2-way and then this, then that, right? I mean, we're not going to be able to see what happens to Ingrid Gamble if you turn everything into a 2-way on 5th and 6th, because that Ingrid Gamble, likely increases traffic, right? We're not going to be able to see all of those different iterations of what happens if this portion of this goes in and that one goes out.
But you'd see the end result.
Yeah, it goes.
So,
Right.
so like the end result is Ingrid Gamble is shown in here as being complete streets projects with changes. So those combined with the 5th, 6th change, what would the overall network look like? So you'd still be able to get a picture, but you're right. We're not doing it in a vacuum to be like, this is the only change to the network in the next 20 years. Because we know it's not going to be the only change to the network in the next 20 years. But if you wanted to do that, that would be separate outside of kind of what we're doing as part of the MTP.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think the reality of like, it sounds great, that we run it with that situation, but you don't see the implications across the network.
I think that's where the completion of the Pell will come in as well. Because it's broader than just Gamble and Ingrid. I know they're looking at 5th and 6th and other things. So I wonder, Aaron, in terms of amending the MTP, let's say the Pell finishes in 2024. Then are we able to amend the MTP to say, okay, this is the alternate? We can leave the realistic open.
But I will say, we'll be in the middle of the next update for the MTP, so, that's why we don't do amendments, because we're always in the update. The next update is actually technically gonna be starting next year, basically this fiscal year. And so if the PEL finishes within the next couple of years, then that's an opportunity to look at updating the MTP as part of that next update.
Melinda, did you have something?
Yeah, kind of 2 main topics. I'm pretty focused on this fiscal constraint. I'll just talk about that briefly, but I want to go back to this 5th and 6th because I've been eyeballing that one as well. the fiscal constraint, having some balance and looking at the northern communities versus the bowl. Similar to how we did some split with the Matsu and looking at the whole state and per capita, vehicles and some sort of way to divvy it up. Is any of that been done for this MTP 2050 to try to look at what type of balance was there as far as funding with the fiscal constraint, as far as northern communities' interests and desires and needs and wants versus the rest of the bowl?
No,
No, we didn't break up the fiscal constraint by community.
because we're all one MTO.
Okay, I'm just trying to, say, when it came to scoring, and there's a lot of interest to getting all of the road grids within the bowl in a better pedestrian, non-motorized friendly state, but then how do we ensure that there's some balance of, the goals and interests in northern communities and Artillery Road and some of the pathways that they would like to see, just putting it out there.
I mean, for us, our goals and objectives apply to every part of the AMAT's boundary. They don't change between the bowl and Chugach Eagle River Oak.
Okay, all right. So that was that comment. The next is the timing of the 4-year update, knowing that it's a 4-year cycle, right? So it's, the reason I eyeball that 5th and 6th, because it shows what, nearly, over 55 million identified towards it, but that's still looking at a what if scenario. The fact that we have the Kinney Engineering is going to be working on the downtown engineering study. And I think MOA and all of us have a lot of hope of what's going to come out of that, giving a very detailed look. Before we're obligating and identifying, 50, almost $56 million, maybe that's something that really wouldn't be cemented until the next 4-year cycle. So it might be, I'm just trying to find a way, could we free up some funding of anything that's in that downtown grid that's still the unknowns that could help the engineering study inform us better. Looking for ways to free up money.
I mean, now that downtown engineering study has started, technically it's kind of in the same vein as the PEL.
Right,
The studies
what I'm getting.
hasn't really started, so it's not technically underway. I think they're getting the consultant on board and other stuff like that, but they haven't actually started doing an analysis or anything like that. So, it's snapshot in time for us. And when we did our snapshot, that project hadn't started. So, I mean, if the committees want to, you could remove this project and say, hey, we need to wait for the downtown street engineering study to finish before we put anything in here. Just because it's in the MTP right here, doesn't mean 55.8 million is committed. We're not gonna obligate this funding tomorrow.
Fiscal constraint that we're looking at.
Yeah, but, so I guess who's paying for this project? We'd have to look and see who's paying for it. Is that DOT funding or AMAT's funding?
Right now it's DOT.
Okay. So then, yeah, if you remove that, you could free up 55.8 million to use on other things that are DOT specific. It's up to what the committees want and are comfortable with.
And I'll just add that this scope, the order length is different than the downtown streets engineering study. So this has a much broader,
Yeah.
L to read, so that includes that Merrifield section, right? And then I have a map of the downtown streets.
Stops at Ingra Gamble.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
It's from coastal to Ingra.
And if there's any other streets that are looking, A and C, they're looking at
Yeah, I mean, there.
That
there's
is
a lot of projects
improving.
downtown.
non-motorized facilities.
And we can look at the map and you can see there are a ton of projects. Area.
Well, it kind of brings up an interesting point because the PEL is underway and I believe the PEL covers that portion of Fifth Avenue out of town from Ingra Gamble over to Airport Heights. So technically we shouldn't have this project extending over there. Because if we're not putting other projects in because we're waiting for the PEL to finish, then we shouldn't have this project in there either. For that
I
portion.
mean, that's why it's like fiscal constraint and timing. Those are the two things. It's
Yeah.
like, we're all interested in, is there a way to add? But I understand if I add, then what comes off the plate? So.
Yeah.
Trying to help.
So I think I would have a hard time. I mean, I definitely hear that, and I think that, is that the criteria that if something isn't like already studied and designed, it's not added? I mean, are we gonna apply the same analysis to every project like that? Because I don't think that's what we do. And I also feel like a score of 79 on a complete streets project downtown, we're all aware of the issues. Needing to address our traffic patterns in downtown. I would have a hard time taking that off and prioritizing something that scored much lower personally. And I guess I'm just stuck on the scoring thing of like, so if we go back to the complete streets projects and look at like, where do the ones get dropped off? Where were they automatically just cold because they didn't score high enough?
You say like on the 40s?
Yeah, again, this is the project list that we publicly shared for the work session that you all had on the financial analysis. We did make some, like calculation tweaks after that, to clean up our spreadsheet, so that the list changed slightly between what is presented here and what is in the draft document that the public reviewed. But as a example, basically
40s, 50s.
Yeah. And again, it depends on who was funding it, where their funding ran out, kind of thing.
So it looks
And
like,
what projects fit within the remaining funding. So sometimes, a lower project made it in because it was as that land use and transportation integration study, like the 100,000. So that could fit in when a $2 million project couldn't, even if there was a $2 million project that scored higher.
and so who makes that determination in this draft for these projects? Is that staff? Okay. So then I guess, can we go back then to the ones that you scored for the NHS projects? Okay, so this is interesting too, because they all seem to score pretty low. And I guess I'm, because you said you're waiting for direction. I think you need direction from the policy committee. Okay, I wonder why. Why aren't these? Are these the only NHS ones that were scored?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, that's interesting.
Well, no, do we have other NHS projects on the list? The reason these ones are scored right now is because they were already in the tip. And we didn't score them when we did the scoring for the MTP. So we're going back and scoring these ones here.
Mhm.
So you can see how these scores compare with all the other ones.
There's
There's
the other NHS ones.
all the other projects, every other project. We don't break it out by NHS, non-NHS.
Oh, okay.
We don't. All of them are the same. These just happen to be the NHS ones from the tip that were not scored, that we just scored now.
So why aren't these ones automatically called by staff if they score so? Why do you need direction from the policy committee? Why don't we have the same baseline?
They were included in the draft document that the public reviewed.
Okay.
So right now, we're looking at wholesale updating the draft document for the final document. And this was an additional piece of information for the committees, that we thought was appropriate to bring forward as part of that discussion. Again, we're talking today a lot about projects. We've received a lot of comments about projects, but there were comments about change this goal, change this objective, change this performance measure. If you are interested, we can definitely dig down into those details. As I think a lot of the comments are very valuable, but yeah, I guess.
Yeah, I think for me, like with the artillery road, we know that it's scored low, their scoring criteria compared to other projects, but it is one where I think we have this interesting dichotomy of like, it's scored low, we have a ton of community support for that project.
I
And
don't think it's unique in that.
Okay,
There-
so that's good to know. Yeah,
I mean, there's other projects that,
the scored a little bit had a lot of,
yeah, like those three, motorized projects, adding the pathway in Eagle River. I guess that one wasn't technically scored. That was just changing the project description, but then the two, long trail projects out north, those also didn't score very high, but they received abundant support.
Interesting to take a look at the scoring criteria itself too, because you try and compare the Glen Highway to Potter or something along those lines. I mean, these things don't match up, you know, really well. So I don't know. I'm not sure if that has something to do with it too, but these highway projects may not fit the scoring criteria that we have when we're looking at constraint seats and making an urban setting or some different scenarios there.
I mean, the criteria was developed and approved by the policy committee, the technical advisory committee and the policy committee. So that's what we used for all of the projects. And I will say that, you know, one of the big things that hit a lot of projects is the equity piece. You know, we're trying to bring equity to the more forefront for all transportation projects within the AMATS area. So projects have to demonstrate how they are going to help with equity.
And if I could add, kind of dovetailing off of Aaron's comment right there, you know, when DOT programs the STIP, you know, what criteria, the decision-making process for programming that STIP is based on DOT priorities, policy, and reflection of the comments brought forth on the STIP. They are not necessarily programmed with the AMATS criteria in mind. And so those policies, those theoretical considerations that program the STIP are different than what the AMATS committee has in their goals and objectives for the AMATS, MTP, and the TIP. And so, much like Luke said, you know, these projects have their merit in the realm of DOT facility management, while it might not necessarily align with the values like the disadvantaged communities, which, you know, if any one of those projects scored for the disadvantaged community criteria, would be considerably higher and very clearly indicated as a priority in the MTP. So I just wanted to point out, you know, there's two different criteria sets being used here. And that, I think, is part of the consideration as to where, you know, what weight you put on these projects.
so are you saying that DOT doesn't put weight on disadvantaged communities?
No, I'm saying that DOT uses a different set of criteria than the MTP, which is why you see such a disparity.
It's a statement of fact, not a statement of value judgment.
Yes, it's a statement of fact.
And what's going on in the STIP is not.
Well, I think that's one of the mysteries, right? Because we don't know the scoring criteria for the STIP. We don't know how projects were prioritized. And do they meet the needs of the community or not? What's the justification for keeping things on STEM? Whereas we do have scoring criteria for the MTP.
And that's part of that cooperative process that we talked about earlier is AMATS could say, here's our scores. DOT could be like, here's our scores and our needs and our goals and objectives. And these why these projects should be in here because they're a priority.
And Aaron, for projects to stay or be in a future STIP, it needs to be in MTP as well, the AMAT zero boundary, correct?
That is our understanding from feds and based on federal regulation. Again, there are some people at the state who disagree and say it is not the case.
Right, so that has implications for Artillery Road, for example, if it doesn't make it into an MTP, then it can't be programmed in, yeah, based on our understanding.
It can't have federal funding programs to it. The state can still come in, or the municipality of Anchorage, if it so desired, could pay for project. And when I mean federal funding, I do also mean discretionary grants. Even if you want to seek a discretionary grant, a lot of those grant programs have requirements for projects to be in the TIP, the MTP, or the UPWP. It depends on the grant requirement itself.
So we have,
Sorry, Kevin Cross and Brad Corey both have their hands up.
great. You're gonna first, Brad.
Looks like Brad.
Brad, go for it.
Okay, yeah, so speaking again to the scoring, I just want to emphasize that scoring and models and all the things that we do are just tools. When we looked at the scoring criteria at the TAC and the policy committee, I'm sure too, it wasn't whatever the scores are, this is what's going to decide everything. Instead, this is information that's going to be helpful for decision making. So in some cases, if something's low, I'm totally fine being able to say, you know, here are the reasons why we still put it up and want to include it, even though with the best that we did, you know, we did our very best trying to get the scoring criteria put together. But here's some other reasons that were not fully accounted for. I mean, it'll still, the scoring criteria is still super helpful and it still provides a lot of that, but I think there's going to be some nuances that in my mind are critical and very important. And then the second thing I wanted to say is when it comes to 5th and 6th, Ingrid Gamble and some of those major needs and with upcoming studies, I mean, these upcoming studies are some of the critical things that we have. I would be very sad to see even like potential projects or placeholder projects not included in the fiscally constrained network, so that at the point that we want to like implement something, we have to like go in and do a whole scale like taking stuff out. I would much rather have something in there, not necessarily a placeholder, but something that at least spoke to it the most possible. So like keeping 5th and 6th in there, going in and having whatever funding is identified for that, because a lot of the funding that's needed for 5th and 6th is the signals system. They're old. They need to be replaced. And the question is, do they get replaced to where it becomes two-way, or do they get replaced on the still being one-way? Either way, a lot of those costs are still critical and important, and they're necessary. So I would not support taking out 5th and 6th because it needs something. It's not just a matter of the two-way conversion doesn't create the additional costs. Those costs are already there. The two-way has other factors that we don't quite know yet, but I think it needs to be in there. And same with the section of 5th that's looking at the Pell. And even if there is a way to put something in, I mean, I guess the question for me is, what will streamline implementation of the outcome of these critical studies? If it's having something in there and having some description, having some placeholder, I'm all for it, because I view these two especially as like the most critical for Anchorage for safety. They're in the safety corridors. They change the whole feel of what we're shooting for. And so I'm afraid if we don't have something in there, then it's the same old. You know, we're not really moving the needle on these big ticket items. Thanks.
Thanks. Member Cross?
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's interesting because some of these projects have significant ramifications upon separate but other projects in the immediate vicinity. And just going back to, you know, like the old Glen Highway and whether that goes 2 lanes down to 1 lane. Of course, we saw a bunch of public comments saying they didn't support reducing Old Glen down to from 2 to 1. I do agree that needs some traffic calming measures, but you know, that road is directly affected by, again, the Artillery Road, because that bridge has been shut down 3 times in 10 years for sometimes weeks, if not months, as people crash into it. And then what happens is all the traffic from the highway gets diverted through Eagle River, which is why it's important to have 4 lanes until we do something with Artillery Road. So it's interesting how some of our studies, unless you live there and you see it happening, on how we prioritize these projects, because again, we need to put traffic calming on Old Glen, but until you deal with Artillery Road and we continue to divert traffic the whole Glen Highway traffic through Old Glen, through the heart of Eagle River. I don't know how taking all the traffic that goes to Wasilla to Anchorage and putting it onto a 2-lane road as opposed to a 4-lane road when that bridge goes down again, which inevitably it will, because it's a low bridge. And I don't ask me why people can't seem to get it through their heads, but give it another year or two, someone's going to hit it again. It'll be interesting on how we prioritize those, understanding that taking care of one situation doesn't necessarily resolve the issue if you haven't taken care of another. So thank you.
And one more thing, Ben White put in the chat, a resource for criteria for evaluating projects that go into STIP. Said it's 17 AAC 05.175 is the criteria for evaluating projects going into the STIP.
So I will just flag that we're closing in on the end of our meeting here in just a little bit. And again, the goal for the work session was for you all to provide us feedback with what more information can we help bring to the table for your next committee or December committee or later if we need more time than that to make determinations on making changes to the MTP based on the public comments received. Is there a format you'd like to see that in? Do you just want us to, take a shot in the dark about proposing things to be added and removed so that there's sort of a straw man to go from? Do you have preferences for what that list looks like? And we can dive into the details about what fits in the fiscal constraint. And what other information, if you want us to flag content changes that seem significant, or just, go with what seems to be reflective of the intent of the document and the goals and objectives so far. What level do you want to see the changes that we're making, I guess, knowing that you will see the full comment response document once we go through every single comment. You will get a chance to review the staff recommended changes, and that will be a voting item. But knowing that there are also over 1,200 comments, I'm not sure how many of you will be able to look at those in great detail. So what is most helpful for us to do to support you all in your future decision-making on coming to a final end?
It is the next step for the technical advisory group to review sort of the next steps that you guys work on, the next list, or however, what form that is.
Yep.
And make a recommendation then to policy.
Right, so it's, what actions would you all like to endorse in terms of changes to the MTP? But that action item would happen at a regular meeting.
Where there's a safety criteria, but I guess for me, if we're gonna talk about the O'Malley to time and project, it'd be helpful to know what the crash history is along the corridor, including the interchanges. And are those, whether those are higher than. And, because I would think that if there's safety concerns there, which I think there are, that would increase the priority of the project. So to have that. I think for the committee, I'm gonna look at it myself, but I think the whole.
Yeah, we did get data from the municipality of Anchorage on crash histories for these routes and use those to help score and rank. Almost all of them scored the max possible points for safety, aside from like the transit, because some of them don't have transit on it and won't benefit transit. But almost all of them scored the max possible for safety. It's a lot of the other criteria that they didn't score high on.
The last 3 on there, those aren't currently on there, to be correct.
The STIP 3 is the only one that's not in the draft 2050 MTP.
And so you guys just scored that for informational purposes.
Yeah, because it's a new project that has been asked to be added to the TIP. The port has asked for that project to be incorporated and added in.
So that would be part of like the amendment that you're bringing forward with that.
It would have to be a discussion of the committees whether or not they wanted to add that project to the MTP, because it's not on our list of MTP projects at this point. So we didn't automatically add it in. It's in this list here because It was one of the ones that we scored and ranked.
I like, so it seems like two of those projects are a little bit redundant, the 98 to 98 to 118. Yeah, so both of those are barely in, I mean, that's right, isn't it? The south part of Todd.
But you touch AMAX's boundary, so it's part of our plan.
So how do you consider that, say, fiscal constraint? Consider the whole project, because it's, I think the.
We did a calculation, you know, this is all planning level, so we did a calculation of about how much of that
Okay.
percent is in our boundary and included that in this constraint. So I think it's only 90 million
Versus
of
the
the
600.
600 and some million of that entire.
Request for, from Kevin Cross to have the Old Glen Highway and the artillery road be scored, reflecting combining motorized and non-motorized artillery and removing and reduction.
But from generally being on the scoring committee for the last round. To Luke's point, number of the other conversations. The tip scoring criteria is not generally considering freeway resiliency and other things. To some members Cross's point, when a bridge is struck, you see a number of those projects on here, like incident management, traffic accommodations. So that includes putting in roundabouts and other accommodations, so that way, when the highway does shut down, because it does, then we're trying to figure out how to route, 50,000 vehicles a day on an on-ramp and an off-ramp, right? Those kinds of things, which, and on some of the projects, the bridge is about, its bridge rating is such that we need to go and replace the bridge. There's no tip scoring criteria to consider whether or not you're already in the area to have to replace a bridge, whether or not you go in, reconstruct the interchange as part of that kind of operation. So just know that there's other considerations that may be out there that, aren't portrayed in a score.
I think, Sean, you kind of captured it better than I think I did there. I think that incident management, traffic accommodations is a good example. I would assume that that's scored very low on multimodal scoring criteria or some of the other things, because it's not part of that specific project's intent.
Yeah, that's why the scores are just a tool. We've had scores in the past or projects that scored super low. For example, Mountain Air Drive was one of our lowest scoring projects for the TIP, but the policy committee decided that was a need and put it in. That's all this is here for. That's why we as staff didn't make a decision whether to remove them or add them. We're needing the committees to tell us what to do, and the scores are just there to help you with that decision.
Keep asking this because it's what I need for your next meeting. Is there a specific action item that you would like to see at your next meeting? Do you just want us to come up with what that is? A list? Do you have, I think we've heard some things like scores that would be helpful for that. I'm not sure if we're doing a 20-point scoring system on 3 different projects between 6 different people, that we're gonna be able to have that by Thursday. So I think that could be something that would push this to your December meetings. But it's also a pretty hefty item, I would say. So. Yeah.
I guess I'd kind of still like to have us take a look at how the overlap of the downtown engineering study plays into the other projects that are listed. Fit and Six and A and C with the goals of making those more, pedestrian friendly. I mean, because that is what the focus of that engineering study is going to look at. And then have a way for us to look at the color of the money, overlap that, so that DOT can take a look at it. I think you guys are the primary ones, if those are your road corridors, and consider, could that be something that could be deferred into the next go around? After we let that form, that study inform us, and then we can maybe have more clarity of defining, is it a $56 million? Or is it something that's good enough until the next go around? But again, that's more in the DOT arena. I think for me, I didn't bring up one project from PM&E's side, Turnigan Boulevard. I did see a lot of comments about Northern Lights Boulevard to McRae and Turnigan Boulevard. Did I say arm?
I think it's turning street, right?
Turnigan Street. Okay, Turnigan Street. That one I'd kind of like to look at again with the color of money from PM&E's side to see how could we get that on this 2050
And that one,
NTP,
I
because
think-
I just talked to Gary Jones, there's almost no other clear way that we can afford that project using bond funds. We have a DSR, it's sat for many, many years because until we find a funding vehicle, that one will be a challenge.
yeah, so that one is just barely not programmed, so.
So if we can line them up, I'd like to take another strong look at that one. And again, I look at categories, if there's something that's still in the what if scenario versus we kind of already know that this is fully desired. There's maybe something that can just fall off and be deferred until the next NTP update.
So the big problem with Turnigan Street is there's a lot of right of way impacts.
I know.
And so the design that's been looked at all these years is just never gonna happen. And so the discussion needs to be, should we relook at that design to see if there are other changes that could be done besides widening the road? Because, you look at the, like, you're taking all the homes along there. And I believe we actually got a comment on there from, I think Anna Brawley submitted a comment about looking at a reconnaissance study and fund that to see if there can be some different stuff done over the years. So, that kind of comment, we need a decision from you all on. Do you want us to add in a study to look at that versus leaving it as, as is?
I
So
think a study would be good. And that's the kind of phasing that I'm looking at flexibly with this fiscal constraint parameter of, instead of saying, okay, it's gonna obligate the whole constructed project versus phasing something so that we can just look at it and have more clarity before we commit more of that fiscal constraint.
And I will just say to that point, I think would be definitely a way to go. But this is our 2050 plan. So the fiscal constraint is through 2050.
Yeah.
So just because we, if we do a study in theory, that means that we want to do a construction. And so hopefully all of that happens between now and 2050. So I think it's not a 4-year program. It's not a 6-year program. It's our 27-year program. And it's not, we're not obligating money besides what's in the TIP or the STIP, or the CIP, but yeah, I think I would just caveat, thinking about taking things in and out. If we want them to happen between now and 2050, this is the document to include them in between now and 2050.
So it's either lining it up and looking at the other projects to see, can we review the priority again, or just allocating some reconnaissance study money towards it. And then maybe at that point, the clarity is looked at again, compare it again for the next update in 4 years. And, I don't know which one's more, I don't know, if staff could look at that, Appreciate it. I think hopefully the tech will weigh in.
Yeah, I just would like to know, just if we are thinking about changing out some projects, adding Artillery Road, for example, just if there's any projects we're going to discuss, just to know if there's like, one option would be, I think, a Tudor Road interchange, right? So like, how many years does that project have to wait? So if we're gonna discuss, you know, taking money out of one project to fund another, if there's real safety concerns about that, or, you know, some sort of bridge is at the end of his life, it'd be good to know. I'm looking at you with just, you know, when we're talking about that, just to know, because there is infrastructure that has lifespan that we might be discussing, just would be good to know that. Or having a little bit more background, just to make sure we don't take something out that's really critical to a much bigger piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, I can bring status information for the next stack meeting when we're talking about that. I like this idea though. We've got the different colors of money identified, which each of this one, so we're trying to mix and match things during our discussions. It's easier to find which ones we mix and match which.
Yeah, what we would do is bring back the dreaded financial analysis Excel that has it all broken down into the 3 pots of funding. And then if somebody's like, remove this project, add this one, we can easily switch it on the fly, so you can kind of see. I can help it.
Okay. Any other requests?
I'll just say also, good job to AMAT staff. I mean, 1,000+ comments is a lot, and to sort it and organize it. I have to say, good job, and it's a big conversation navigating a big deal of work. So, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great. If you have any other follow-up comments, feel free to let me know, but we're running out of time here, so. Christine, is there anything else online? Okay. Thank you.